So I wanted to just have a really general discussion and with you about incorporating agriculture and land use in GCM simulations, and a couple of comments first. One, it says land use, human land use. I'll be focusing on agricultural land use, although I know there's been some interest. I think Michael had some interest in urban land use, so we can talk about that a bit later. Secondly, Michael had actually given a talk on this, I think a couple of years ago, something similarly. So I'll be revisiting some of the things that he mentioned and talking about some more current studies. But there's already been sort of a wealth of work done at GISS looking at land surface processes. So we have a dynamic vegetation model that Nancy, we have on Skype too, by the way. So Nancy, you can just shout out and we can all hear you. So the dynamic vegetation, irrigation has been incorporated into the model. So we sort of have components to of all these land use assessments around that would be great to discuss how we can bring these components together. Thirdly, I'm not a land surface person myself. However, this has been something I've been obsessing over for a while, and part of that is because I've been working for the last couple of years with an agricultural model intercomparison project, or AgNet, which there are a bunch of people here representing from the impacts group. And we've learned a lot about how climate change could potentially impact crop production and crop yields. And from a global perspective, the agricultural crop area and management data sets are now reaching a level of detail and a level of coverage that could be useful to climate model simulations. And so that's something that, that I'd like to address as well. So I think a lot of us, and I'm not sure if you can say it, yeah, so are familiar with historical land use trajectories over time and sort of what the land use transitions have been like. So just as an overview, this is cropped area only, and actually I'm sorry, my citations have kind of been cut off. But these are cropped areas only based on a Ramacutty and Foley data set. And so you can see sort of just a wide swath of ice-free land, right, is covered by agricultural land use or crop land use. On the bottom, I'm actually showing differences between 1850 and 2007 and 1950 and 2007. So we have large expansion of agricultural lands, area coverage, also of intensification of the already planted areas or cropped areas between 1850 and 2007. If we look at 1950 to 2007, we do see some areas of decreased coverage as well, right? Mostly in the eastern US, over Europe and Eastern Europe, and over East Asia and Eastern China as well. Now, this is the corresponding pasture coverage, so this data set has sort of teased them out. And again, on the bottom, we see between 1850 and 2007, this sort of vast expansion of pasture land. But when we move up towards 1950, we see these decreases. So the point being that not only do we have to consider, right, what our current agricultural land use, crop pasture land use is like and how that interacts with our current climate. That's my musical interlude. No, that's okay. Not a problem. We also have to consider sort of these transient changes over time, right? These land use transitions between crop, pasture area, and back to. Nancy, would you be able to just hit mute for just enough? Yeah, I don't want to mute. Sure. Yeah, I don't want to mute you just in case you have a question. So I want to, just hear it. Okay, great. Thank you, Nancy. We also have to consider the transitions between these different types of land use and how it evolves over time, right? Now,
could I ask a
sure.
Forestry? Are you including forestry in that?
So this is just crop and pasture, and so what this will consider are those areas that have been converted from forest to crop and pasture, but not like not a forestry data set per se. But that's an interesting topic that I'll bring up later on.
Yeah, because in the northern, there's nothing.
Of course
there is something.
Right. Yeah. And that's interesting, actually. I don't know. So Alex. So I work very closely with Alex, and he's a wealth of information on this. So if you see something that you want to comment on, just jump in as well too. But no, this is just considering conversions from forest to crop and pasture. Yeah.
Sonali, question.
Yeah.
So are you going to also discuss the various different data sets besides Ramacutty and Foley that have looked at these land cover conversions?
Yeah, so there's, and there are, I'm not today just because I'm trying to just give a general overview and sort of where these data sets are different, but Nancy brings up a good point. And this is actually a point that rears its head in climate model simulations, right? What data set do you use to look at historical transitions? And there's a multitude out there, and when you're looking at land use as the only forcing, that can lead to some pretty big differences. So not today, but that is something.
Just one other thing to add, in addition to the temporal variation,
Yeah.
within agricultural lands, the crop types is a huge area of
Right, so that's a
concern.
whole portion of what I'll discuss. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So just as a general comment, on the global average, when we consider sort of all of the drivers of change, land use tends not to weigh as heavily, and that of the sort of carbon dioxide emissions tend to sort of outweigh those impacts due to land use, particularly with global temperature change or global radiative forcing. It's the regional level where these land use changes become interesting, and the possibility for some large-scale teleconnections that might occur, which is what we're interested in looking in. And what you're seeing here is, for each region, sort of a time series of cropland expansion that goes up to 2000, of pasture in the green, and of total population growth in the purple. Now they all kind of follow the same trajectory of increasing, right, over the 20th century. But you'll see some regional distinctions, right? So Africa, Middle East, and Asia, we see these kind of sharp spikes in population as we move forward. Now this ends at the year 2000, so it's a bit dated. The other thing you'll notice is that in Asia, now they've kind of lumped Asia into one category, and Asia has a large amount of heterogeneity in terms of how crop expansion has taken place. Asia here also encompasses South Asia, which experienced the Green Revolution in the 1960s and 1970s, and through sort of these improved varieties and improved agricultural management, we're able to facilitate a boom in production, and the population booms kind of followed thereafter. If we look at North America and Europe, we see sort of a concern of what may be the beginning of a production, rather of a crop area, sort of an expansion plateau, right? How much more can we sort of expand? And really the question becomes, by what mechanism do we need to feed a growing population? Is it by expanding into lands? What lands are there to expand into? Are they marginal? Are they able to sustain the production we need? Or do we intensify the management practices that we have already? And that's going to lead to some other surface changes that we have to consider. And really it might be a combination of both of these, and how do we sort of represent that in model simulations moving forward?
Okay,
Yeah.
Commonwealth of Independent States.
Yeah, so that's basically the former
I know
Soviet.
what it is.
Yeah.
I'm asking about the last bar in population. I thought the population of the Commonwealth of Independent States actually is flat or declining in the last 20
It's
years.
possible in the last 12 years, you
Last
said?
20 years.
20
since
years.
the wall fell.
So yeah, so this is
And it looks
right.
like
So
it's
this is
increased there.
2000
So I don't know, is
data.
that a 50-year time stamp?
Yeah.
What's the last bar?
It's 1950 to 2000.
It is. I couldn't
Yeah.
tell because it says 2000
It
AD
says
below.
2000 AD.
But I don't know if
Yeah,
that's
I
the
think it's
bar
a 50-year.
for-
Yeah, yeah.
okay.
I believe it's a 50-year average. I can check that, but I don't think that it's kind of looking at that fine scale difference. that
I was
we talked
also
about.
just curious, in Latin America, is that the conquistadors that wiped out Latin America? It's pretty amazing to see it in the population.
That whole dip there,
Yes.
right? Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So yeah. So I mean, well, the point being is that there's a lot of
Smallpox, not conquistador.
Well,
by
maybe
who?
they conquistadors blankets.
Right. Well,
brought
yeah.
us.
So there's a lot of regional variation, right? That needs to be accounted for, which is interesting. So this is a figure that I love this figure. I feel like everyone who's taken your basic introduction to atmospheric science, sees this figure. This is of southwestern Australia. And the light's on, so it's a bit hard to see. But you kind of have the western portion of the continent here, which is at this point is bare soil. It's just after harvest, and this portion is all the underlying vegetation is natural vegetation. There's not a lot of variation over the year, and that boundary is marked on land by a rabbit-proof fence. And of course, most of you probably know this. But I just find it, sort of fascinating, right? That this particular, now there's actually sort of a network of rabbit-proof fencing in Western Australia. This is actually one of the shorter ones, and it runs about 750 kilometers. So pretty large scale land use, cultivated versus natural vegetation that we're talking about. And of course, the natural vegetation, communicates with the atmosphere through its surface, the moisture and energy fluxes, and we've got cloud cover. And part of this makes you think, okay, well, if we see such a distinct difference between cultivated and uncultivated lands on this scale, what else could be impacted? How does this interact with the overlying circulation? Are there downstream teleconnections? It sort of gets you thinking about the scale that land use needs to be at in order to affect change, right, in these areas. Okay. Now, we actually capture, because you know, in the GISS model, we use the Pongratz-Hurt land use transitions, historical land use transitions. We're capturing a lot of what we know as a gross estimate in terms of agricultural lands fairly well. So these are the crop and pasture that I'd shown earlier, and these are directly from the input files that we use here at GISS. Now, of course, they combine pasture and cropland together, so you're kind of seeing the combination here. And so, huge swath of land devoted to production at this point, right? Be it crop or pasture.
Right,
We are,
Sonali?
yeah.
The way that's used in the GISS GCM is that I think cropland and pasture are, it's just crops that are represented.
Right, yeah.
So we're not really doing transitions between land uses here.
Yes. So that and that's an important point. And they're all represented by sort of this generic grasses as well too, which is the point that I was going to make. So yeah, you're absolutely right. And the one thing that we do capture here that we actually are starting to look at here at GISS a little bit in some recent simulations is the decline that we see here in coverage between 1950 and 2007 as well too. So on the whole, we're sort of capturing these broad changes. That said, we are not accounting for specific crops. We're not accounting for planting dates and harvest dates or cropping calendars or anything of that sort just yet. But that's something that I think that we can talk about. Okay, so just as an overview, land cover and climate interactions fall into sort of two major categories. One is the biogeochemical category that basically looks at sort of the carbon storage between the atmosphere and the plants and the transactions between them, and basically, you know, how the sink of carbon changes on land depending upon land use changes. We can talk about nitrogen there, and I'll do that in just a minute, but not right now. The next category is this biogeophysical category, which is much more uncertain depending upon the location. So we consider albedo, we consider the height of the vegetation and roughness. We consider interactions with surface hydrology, the evapotranspiration, surface energy, energy and moisture fluxes and transport, and also downstream teleconnections, which I'll come back to, which is sort of an emphasis for me. Now, these feedbacks that we consider, you know, they interact with each other quite a bit, and they dominate, they change in how they dominate seasonally and also geographically. And there's kind of three mechanisms that are tossed around and things that we like to consider, but we have to realize that there's interaction between these mechanisms, right? So there's an albedo mechanism, and that the vegetation has a lower albedo, which raises the surface temperature by enhancing absorption. And this tends to, we see the signature more often at higher latitudes, right? So when you have forests that mask snow cover seasonally, right? So that snow albedo isn't able to sort of come through. There's an evapotranspiration. Yeah.
Just one correction. Vegetation sometimes has a lower albedo, depending on what the other surface is. Of course, compared to snow, it's lower. But in terms of like other soil cover, it has a high albedo in the near infrared. So it can actually have a higher albedo when the vegetation is very active.
Right. Yeah. So generally speaking, yeah, that's absolutely true as well, and it's very dependent upon vegetation type. So these are just general mechanisms and sort of where they might sort of reside and manifest a bit more. But that's true. Then there's an evapotranspiration mechanism. So the vegetation that has a particularly high ET efficiency can increase latent heating and lower the surface temperature. And this we find sometimes at lower latitudes. But Nancy makes a good point. These are very generalized mechanisms that we see here and are highly dependent upon where they're occurring, what type of vegetation was there. When we're looking at changes, we have to consider what vegetation was replaced, and even sort of the orientation, right, of these parcels of land with respect to major atmospheric circulation features and things like that. The last is a roughness mechanism, and it's sort of here. talked about mainly in view of forests, right? So vegetation could potentially lead, especially forested areas, lead to increased convergence and upward moisture fluxes, and we might see more rainfall in these particular areas. Again, very generalized mechanisms and how they play out, particularly in the mid-latitudes and temperate zones. There's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that, and these are things that we can start to analyze quite well with a climate model. Okay, so I kind of dug through the literature and pulled out some major findings that I wanted to kind of bring up. First, there are many regionally and localized effects that vary widely and oppositely, which is the important point, right? Because on the global average, you might not see some of these effects, or they might not become as prominent as you'd expect. But there are regional effects that are quite important that I think we can capture now with the detail and resolution of our models. Teleconnections have been identified in many studies, these are just a few, between tropical land use, primarily deforestation, and major circulation features, so the Hadley circulation and trades, but also the northern hemisphere jet stream. Now, actually, by what mechanisms these teleconnections occur, I think that's sort of a ripe area for research in our climate models, and we have the ability to do that. In the US in particular, there is a cooling of areas devoted to wheat, due in part to increased transpiration based upon what was replaced, and also the introduction of irrigation. Now, Ben and Michael, the irrigation has been a sort of a major area of study here at GISS, and this is kind of corroborated by the most recent findings that show irrigation is a pretty impactful global forcing in terms of the cooling that it inhibits. However, there are areas that display a warming, such as the southeast United States, and exactly why and through what mechanisms and how to attribute warming, if there's any, due to land use change, as opposed to sort of an emissions-based warming. That's something that we have yet to understand. Simulating nitrogen changes may also be important. This becomes a bit more complicated as you need models that are capable of doing this. But nitrogen is known to buffer the response of vegetation to CO2 and also influence the sort of this fertilization effect that we expect. This vegetation boom under climate, under near term at least, increases in CO2. How does this actually work once you start including the nitrogen cycle? That's something that, again, is ripe for research.
Wouldn't it enhance the sort of CO2 fertilization effect? You get nitrogen fertilization.
Yeah, so the mechanism that was introduced here, I was actually looking at that. Let me talk about that later. But this is actually reduced. Yeah. So I was
my
actually
understanding
looking at
is an accurate nitrogen cycle would reduce the CO2 fertilization above considering that there's always adequate nitrogen. So
Right.
if you move away from always having nitrogen present to
Right.
actually responding, then you'll have nitrogen reductions which reduce the CO2 effects. So it's we could word that.
Right, exactly. So assuming non-limiting conditions. Right. Okay. So including so this is something else that I think that we can do in some form without major changes to the model, and it's something I've been harassing Ben and Michael about for quite a while now. But including explicit crop phenology. Carbon allocation LAI, also the planting and harvest dates, these things, were found in some studies to create for better agreement, particularly in rainfall over some locations, and I'll go into some of those results in just a minute. In South America, supplanting forests with pasture land, which has been historically the trend there, reduces evapotranspiration in this particular area, and they've noticed local temperature increases despite increases in albedo. In Australia, this is the rabbit-proof fence experience, and what the figure that I had shown, or the image that I had shown, was for bare soil, just sort of after a crop had been harvested. Of course, that sort of cloud cover pattern does change during the growing season, once there's vegetation there, and so there are sort of these seasonal cycles in sort of the change of rainfall and moisture transport that become important as well too. Okay, so the next slides I wanted to show are some older studies, but they illustrate just the sorts of sensitivity tests that we might want to consider doing here, using what we have without major model development. So the first was using the Hadley Center model, and basically what they compared was the influence of current land use, right, compared to a potential natural vegetation data set. And I'm going to go through these fairly fast so we can revisit them to talk about some details. But they have shown each season here, December, January, February, March, April, May, so winter, spring, summer, fall. And what you'll notice is the distinct cooling that occurs particularly in the northern hemisphere, right, during winter and spring. Now, this was attributed mostly to the fact that between the actual vegetation and the natural potential vegetation, there was a decrease in forest cover and sort of the snow masking effect, which contributed to the cooling in the areas. There could be a lot of other mechanisms at play, but then these are just general sort of experiments and sensitivity tests. The next one I quickly wanted to show was a study that sort of compared sort of 4 extreme management styles. Because management is kind of an interesting thing to explore in a GCM because it's not something that we automatically think about. But these, so this is an older experiment run by David Lobel, and he looked at the impact of a simulation with irrigation. We've done this to a bit more of a detailed degree here at GISS. He also looked at no-till. Now, so this is, we're not disturbing the soil very much over here. There's perhaps residue on the surface of the soil from the previous crop. And the way that he implemented the no-till was to basically just do a simple adjustment to the albedo at the surface, okay? Based upon some data sets that had looked at the albedo differences between a no-till agricultural site and one where there was tillage. He then multiplied the LAI by 2, and then also included multiple cropping seasons, so 2 growing seasons and 1 instead of just looking at 1 growing season. And probably the most dramatic difference that we see here, this is the albedo change between each of these simulations and the control. And the 2 simulations that sort of give you the most major response is that of irrigation. We see a cooling across most land areas. Again, that's something that's been corroborated in studies done here at GISS. Higher resolution studies, more updated studies. And then there's this cooling response due to the no-till agriculture. Now, this was a really quick sort of implementation he used by just looking at albedo. Definitely, I think something we could probably do here, but might there be a better way to incorporate it too. The idea of incorporating management is something that I think is interesting. It would be definitely interesting from an impacts perspective as well too. This last study I wanted to show was for US specific. There's actually a lot of regional variation in the response of land use change in the United States that we're trying to understand. Some are more straightforward. This particular study was done with a regional climate model. These are just sort of all the different variables he chose to look at, which contrasted a modern land cover with a potential vegetation data set. And I should mention here, again, there's no planting dates or harvest dates, and there's not really an actual resolution of what crop it is. And if we just look at the temperature response, so this goes actually, it's about, so T max is actually -6 to +6, and the average, that's T min in the middle, which is -2 to +2, and this is -2 to +2 as well too. So some pretty significant surface temperature changes that accompany some other changes. But in the US Southeast, which is not shown here, in other studies are actually showing a warming too. So there's this whole regional variation that we need to understand based upon what crop is there. And I'll show a little bit more later on that actually looks at the differences between crops. Okay. Yet another study that just looks at sort of cropped areas generalized as a grass, right? This is actually a study run by Julia Pongratz. And this was actually using a coupled climate model run with land use, land cover change as the sole forcing. And what she'd done is actually isolated the biogeophysical effect that we talked about, all those variables and their uncertainties, from the biogeochemical effect. So the biogeophysical effect is the first plot that you see here. The biogeochemical effect is the second plot. And the last plot is the combined effect. So on average, the net effect is a warming, due mostly to these biogeochemical effects, right? There's a lot of deforestation that's happening in the tropical areas. However, regionally, the biogeophysical responses do present something interesting to look at, right? They become important, and you can see kind of how opposite these effects are, if not equal, and that I think bears bears some investigation. Now, she'd actually mentioned some teleconnections as well that were occurring here, and I'll skip that just for now because I'm going to come to that in just a minute. But this is just to show you sort of the magnitude of both of these effects once they're teased out and what they look like put together. Okay, so just after AR4, there was a project called LUCID, which is the Land Use Climate Identification of Robust Impacts Experiments. And they had taken 7 of the CMIP3 models and prescribed SSTs, prescribed sea ice extent, and also prescribed crop and pasture conditions reflecting 1870 and then 1992. So just these two years. And this is the change in crop and pasture cover between 1992 and 1870 that they implemented in the models. So you see some of that decrease in area there. Planting and harvest, again, were not included here. They were just kind of looking at these gross estimates. The other thing, and Nancy, you know, it would be great afterwards to hear your comments about this, they didn't specify how each of these modeling groups should implement natural vegetation, okay? And so each of these modeling groups uses either a different data set or some prognostic natural vegetation. And what that results in is some variation between the models of what the natural vegetation looks like around these crops. So the cropped areas at the bottom here, these orange areas are grasslands. The green areas are evergreen cover. The blue is the deciduous cover, and the white is the desert. And again, this is for North America and for Eurasia. Again, you can see the variation in the natural vegetation, right? So what is the sensitivity, we have to ask, right? To having different natural vegetation distributions around your crops. And so these are sort of the these are the simulation responses. So the black boxes that you see are for the land cover change only experiments. The top are for the sea surface temperatures and carbon dioxide experiments. And what we can see for North America and for Eurasia, again, so this is the available energy, so this is sort of the at the surface, and then this is the 2-meter temperature. And all the signs are the same pretty much, so that's sort of heartening, but at the same time, the variation between the models in what the response is to these forcings is much greater with the land use land cover change as opposed to the sea surface temperature and CO2. The models converge quite a bit there. And again, this is the P minus E anomaly, and you can see here again a much greater spread amongst the models in terms of how they're simulating these changes due to these forcings, the response due to these forcings. And so this group has sort of attributed a lot of these changes to the differing natural vegetation. And as we move towards implementing dynamic vegetation into our models, understanding how that might interact with the cropped area becomes an interesting topic of research. Okay, so moving on to coupled land use experiments. And into the future as well too. We've been looking at a lot of historical land cover changes. This was a comparison of CMIP5 models running RCP 2.6 and RCP 8.5. Now, each of these RCPs has an associated land use trajectory with it, right? And that was created by the same integrated assessment model, or rather, one integrated assessment model that was used in creating these RCPs, right? So, crops, again, are just kind of treated, it's a generic crop that's treated as a grassland. RCP 8.5 assumes that more area is needed for food production to keep pace with population, right? And so the cropped area is substantially expanded, and this is the difference from 2005. So these are the expansions of cropped area in RCP 8.5. RCP 2.6 achieves mitigation in part due to the expansion of biofuel production. Okay, so we are still looking at expansion of cropped areas. Particularly, you can see some in the U.S., which you don't see in RCP 8.5. You actually see some reductions here. So we have to consider these. Now, these are just sort of one trajectory for each RCP, okay, which will be important a little bit later when I bring this up. So the Hurt et al. 2005 was used for the historical land use transitions, and that was made to kind of connect seamlessly to these future projections based upon the RCPs. When we look at sort of these land use projections alone, there is some variation between the models. So the Kenya SM and the Hadley Center were two models that, as a sample of, as a subset, that showed significant regional temperature changes due to land use land cover change. And if you look at the temperature response, this is for land areas only, I should say, so all land grid boxes only. These are considered significant of almost exact opposite sign, right? So there are sign changes between what the models are projecting as the changes, right? And so although when compared to CO2, these might not be really massive or significant changes or influential changes, the fact that such a big discrepancy exists, a sign change exists, I think needs to be explored. You can see variation in the albedo as well too. Remember that these models are all incorporating sort of the natural vegetation around their cropped areas differently as well too. Okay, so a quick area, and I won't take too much longer, but a quick area of expansion that I think is interesting. It's sort of the incorporation of specific crops and even crop models into GCM simulations. Now, I am not proposing that we put a crop model into ModelE. As we know, that would probably take a very long time. However, it's something interesting to be aware of and to explore. So the Hadley Center model was recently coupled with a crop model, the General Large Area Model, GLAM. And so GLAM was used, was originally developed to simulate groundnut in tropical and subtropical areas. And in sort of their initial studies, they found that really significant relationships exist between the crop response, the growth, and important agroclimate metrics, right, temperature and rainfall, at scales of 50 to 300 kilometers. So this becomes interesting from a climate modeling standpoint, right? The GLAM requires a daily time series of rainfall, temperature, radiation, humidity variables. These are things it obtains from the climate model dynamically. Root extraction front deepens during the growing season at a crop-specific rate. That comes from GLAM. The crop is sown when the surface soil moisture exceeds a threshold, and I'll show you in 1 minute. GLAM is actually embedded now into the land surface model of the Hadley atmosphere model. That's coupled to the Hadley atmosphere model, and so it's getting this information. These models were communicating with each other, right? It's getting its information on soil moisture from the land surface model. It's about 120-day growing period is what they're simulating for groundnut. And so after a certain amount of thermal time, right, of a certain amount of heat is accumulated, each stage is completed. If the plant is stressed, everything is terminated, right? Now, assuming that the plant is not stressed, the GLAM model will provide a yield of the crop. And over here, yeah, crop canopy size is also represented and increases at a prescribed rate. And provided that the crop is growing the way that it should be growing, the amount of yield it will eventually have increases during the growing season at a prescribed rate as well. So I won't go into the schematic too much just here, but we can talk about it afterwards. I'm not sure that we're really going to be doing this for GISS, but GLAM has actually been sort of implanted into MOSES, which is the land surface component of the Hadley model, right? And in order to do this, they introduced a plant functional type, a crop plant functional type, that was based upon the GLAM model. So it's basically taking all the attributes of what this crop is and its interactions with the soil, its interactions with the atmosphere, its major attributes, and they're using, to do that, they're using the GLAM crop model to get that information. So the GLAM parameterization was used for canopy expansion. However, that canopy expansion is dependent upon the soil water availability. That is obtained from MOSES. So again, there's communication between these models. GLAM was used within the land surface model to alter the rooting depth, and then the above ground biomass and harvest index were computed and saved. So the yield was basically saved. So now we have a yield based upon the crop growth and how its growing season evolved. And we have all our climate variables from our climate model as well too. So we can kind of look at both in sort of one simulation. So this was interesting too. This is, so you'll see day of the year down here. This is the potential start date, or the start date of a 120 growing period cycle, right? So you're kind of looking at the sowing window, right? How long can you sow this crop for? As you move down into the tropical regions, you see just more of these, right? And in fact, in some regions, they were able to just have one crop grow right after another crop, right? You can have multiple growing seasons in one. as you move higher in altitude, your sowing window is decreased a little bit. So you can kind of think about how you might alter planting dates and try to understand what is the sensitivity of your climate model and your regional climate to alter planting dates. And in fact, that was a simulation that they had done. And I've got I want to wrap up in about 5-10 minutes here, so I'll just quickly go through some of these. So one of the big tests of a crop model is to see how well does it get the observed yield. This is a site in West Africa, and they compared the modeled yield based upon this climate crop model to observations. And you know, it follows it. It's not egregious at all. It does a fairly good job. But in rainfall, the bold black line is the mean of all the modeled years, the climate crop modeled years. The dashed line is the CMAP rainfall. So you can see there's sort of good agreement with the termination of rainfall over the year, although the onset of rainfall for the year is a little bit off. It would have been good to actually see what the climate model had done without the climate crop combination. But these are sorts of the assessments that you can do because you're getting all of these variables at the same time.
Just a quick question related to that. Did they, when they set the threshold for planting, the soil moisture threshold, did they do any sort of analysis of what the model soil moisture is, or did they just grab a threshold value from the literature?
No, I think there was evaluation because GLAM, you know, no, I don't think it was grabbed from the literature, but I'll revisit that. But you know, GLAM is its own crop model that sort of determines, you know, for that specific crop for groundnut in this case, you know, what the sowing window should be, and that's a bit. It's not just pulled from the literature, I don't think.
Because they must have done some tuning because each land source model has its own characteristic soil moisture variability. So
right.
Presumably you would want to at least recognize what the variability, in a
would be.
given soil land surface model is. Yeah.
Right, and I'm sure that's something that they would be looking at in terms of it. And again, this is like a kind of complicated setup to do. That said, it's interesting. I'm going to quickly review the NCAR version, which might be something a bit more applicable to what we're doing. So this I'll come back to a little bit later, but the other thing that they did was compare the years of highest rainfall in June in particular to years of lowest rainfall in Southeast India. So Southeast India, groundnut is a pretty popular crop is there as well. And they compared the highest and lowest years. So the highest years in the bold, the years of lowest rainfall is the dashed line. And they compared it for the simulation using the climate crop coupled model. And the simulation that was not, so not with the dynamic crop model included, okay? And so you can see the differences between the highest and lowest years. Those differences are quite different between these two ensembles, right? And over here you see this is LAI, so this is rainfall that you see up top. LAI is going to be the same because there is no difference in the LAI. There's not really a dynamic crop, so it's going to be the same for each year of the simulation. So there are differences between those. It would be really interesting. So this is for a region over Southeast India that they average. It would be interesting to see what the variation in the differences between these simulations were over all grid boxes that were cropped right in the simulation, just to get a sense of how different the response is. But it's interesting. So major findings: the growing season temperature variability increased with dynamic crops. Feedbacks in the driest years were greatest. They also identified the Sahel, Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Brazil as regions with the strongest climate crop feedbacks. These are actually regions that we are heavily involved in AgNIP as well, and we're from the perspective of doing multiple point-based simulations and trying to understand at a district level and across districts, we're seeing some pretty strong feedbacks as well too that we're interested in exploring. Last couple of slides that we have here. This is so this is the NCAR CESM, and they are including crops within their land component. So it's not a climate crop coupled model per se. I should mention that the CLM, the community land model, does have carbon and nitrogen biogeochemistry. However, they have kind of turned the nitrogen off initially and sort of are just looking at the carbon component and the biogeophysical component. So what they did, whereas groundnut was a tropical crop mostly, right, tropical, subtropical, they looked at the mid-latitude crop coverage in 1992, and they decided to introduce 3 PFTs: maize, soybean, and wheat, right, or a temperate cereal that they've decided to kind of generalize as wheat. And they included it with appropriate crop phenology. And so this is sort of the cropping pattern that you'll see that they employed at the mid-latitude level. Now, their unmanaged and managed vegetation, those PFT, are divided so that they don't actually compete for resources, for water or for nutrients. Now, that can be bad or good. What it does is enables them, if you wanted to apply fertilizer or include that component, some management component, you could do it just to the cropped areas and not the natural vegetation. So it kind of separates that for you a little bit. Again, there's might be pros and cons to doing that. But this is something that's interesting. So this is LAI for Europe and for central Russia. And they've shown distinctly the LAI for corn, for soybean, and this temperate cereals is effectively, they've generalized it to just be wheat. And then they've shown the LAI for what was there before they introduced the PFT. So just sort of this managed crop. It's a grass, right, a C3 grass. And so what you're looking at is the LAI here, and then the LAI for the actual crop, okay? So not only do you see a vast difference between the LAI that was just used as a general crop before, you actually see the growing season here, right? But you see differences between these individual crops as well. This is the Argentina's an interesting case, right? I mean, you have an actual, their growing season is opposite to ours, and you just see what the LAI was like. It was basically flat mostly across the entire year. But this just shows sort of, these are pretty big differences between what we're using in our climate models so far and what we could do with a little bit of extra effort. And it might not on a global basis result in that much of a change, but regionally this could be really interesting to implement. Now when you compare the rainfall from each of these simulations, so they just have a control simulation, their crop simulation, which includes all 3. And then they actually did a simulation where they altered the planting date a little bit to see what that would do. And they did it for this region towards the western US, midwestern US. And you'll see here it's interesting. It's actually not much of a difference between the control and the crop. So this is an observed rainfall data set for this particular area. The late planting actually kind of represents the peak rainfall in this region quite well, if not to the end of the rainfall. So that's interesting. The late planting does a bit better. But again, these are changes that could actually improve, at least regionally, right? Or give you a bit more information regionally as to how your crop, particularly these large-scale monocultures, right, contribute to your regional environment. Now, these particular grid boxes are areas of significant declines in rainfall between the late planting and the control run. So a pretty wide swath of area as well, too. These are big changes. Okay. Promise, last 2 slides, and I'll go through this quite quickly because we can talk about it. But these, so as I had mentioned, the RCPs, one integrated assessment model was used to create the land surface trajectories, the land use trajectories for each of those RCPs, right? In this case, now this is a really new study that has just come out, and my reference got cut out, the Schmitz et al. Study from this year. And they had taken 10 agroeconomic models, which are actually heavily involved in AgNet. They're kind of leading our global agroeconomic initiative. And they intercompared them. And these models, now I'm not an economic modeling expert, but they use a whole range of different inputs and data sets and assume different things for a number of parameters in their model. So they're hard to harmonize, but they did manage to harmonize over population and GDP. And they ran 4 different scenarios, 2 of which also included, so this is 8.5, RCP 8.5, so this is the worst, sort of the most pessimistic climate change scenario. And what you're seeing here is the spread of, between models, of the change in cropped area. Okay, so this is sort of the absolute cropped area and what you're seeing. So this is just for one scenario. So there's the historical land use transitions based upon the high data set, And then from 2005, the models were kind of left to project, and you see the range of results here. If this is just for the S1 scenario, all the scenarios are listed down here, the 4 that they did. S4 and S6 include RCP 8.5, and there's sort of, 2 main conclusions. One, there's a lot of uncertainty in these models that need to be understood and bracketed. But 2, because there is such a range among these models, we are using one integrated assessment model, land use trajectory, for the future. Now, I'm not suggesting we run 1,000 simulations with different model combinations, but to understand what this uncertainty is and bracket it and be able to communicate that, or at least have that understanding in our climate model simulations, could be a useful thing. We just need to acknowledge the fact that that exists. So Alex is probably gonna cringe. This is an older figure, but this is just to illustrate the point. The other thing that we have going on within the impacts group and within AgMIP is a global gridded crop modeling initiative. So instead of running these crop models at a point, they've been expanded to the grid so that you can, so for instance, what you're looking at here are results for rain-fed wheat, end of century RCP 8.5. So under end of century RCP 8.5 conditions, this is what your change in rain-fed wheat yield would be. Now you can see it's overwhelmingly positive here. Wheat does respond favorably to CO2, and there is some uncertainty in these responses that we're understanding. But let's say we wanted to include wheat, or include maize, or include soybean, or any crop into our model, and then think about, after we've done that, famously, we can then think about how we want to project how this might change, what regions would be suitable, what regions aren't showing suitability for these different crops into the future. This global gridded modeling initiative has so many applications and has the ability to really inform our work, and this is all living downstairs, so it's actually kind of neat that it's in-house and gives us the ability to talk about it.
Sonali, what's
yeah.
the resolution of this?
I think it's he's running at 50.
It's a half degree.
Half degree by
This
half
is an
degree.
old slide, and actually
It's an old slide,
at this
yeah.
point, some of it is wrong. So
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
we should get the new
Yeah,
version.
the caveat is it's wrong. This is just more illustrative. But this is at a half degree by half degree, Nancy. Okay, so I'm going to skip to the end here, but these are just some identified in the literature, some areas of development. Need to understand teleconnections, need better implementation protocols. What do we do? How do we replace natural vegetation that's there? We need more coupled experiments from CMIP 5, looking at these land use trajectories. And then eventually understanding the role of the nitrogen cycle would be interesting, perhaps not exactly something we want to do in the near term. There was actually a 2005 study that used Model 2 to look at tropical deforestation at 4x5 that I had found. And they found teleconnections to the US Midwest and the Arabian Peninsula. It might be interesting to revisit that. But these are sort of some general ideas specifically related to Model E, but there's so many studies being done out there. The data sets are becoming more available, there's more coverage, and I think there's so many people in-house that are looking at these types of things that would be interesting to see what we can do on a shorter time scale in terms of sensitivity tests, and on a longer time scale in terms of eventual model development if we want to go down that route. Anyway, thanks very much. Any comments, Nancy?
I just have one comment actually. So now
Yeah.
if you go back to the economics, the Schmitz, yeah, this was actually an AgMIP study too, and I just want to emphasize that the figure on the bottom left you said was the S1, the reference scenario. So that's without any climate change. That's
Right.
just economics evolving in
Right.
time. And once you add climate change, it happens again. But one of the examples in that was one of the models had hardwired in there that China would never export food. That it was just impossible that China would export food. If they had no
Yeah.
food, they'd feed it inside. And none of the other models had that. So that type of, this is really a kind of groundbreaking study in the sense that they actually lifted the curtain and saw what was going on inside these economic models. And there's a lot still to understand.
Right,
And
and
then-
there's, yeah, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
I was just going to say, then when they ran this, you can see it's S1 through S6. There are a couple other climate models and crop models that people use, but they even ran this with no CO2 fertilization effects and trying to get as extreme of a signal as it can. And one of the things that comes out is just the economic development side is really most of what's going to
Yeah.
change between now and or mid-century.
In fact, they attributed most of the uncertainty to the
Yeah.
just the economics alone versus the actually introducing climate. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variability between these models, and we're just really only using one trajectory for each scenario moving forward.
The other thing I'll just
Yeah.
So that's a future scenario. That was a really nice literature review, Sonali, but let's see, where is there a simulation with the historical reconstruction that shows that with or without them, that simulating climate is not as good over the transient change over the last 20th century?
So meaning that that the models don't do a good job if land use is not included, you're saying?
Right.
Yeah.
Because we know we have historical reconstruction, we should be able to say, oh, we put them in and everything suddenly improved.
Right, and it's not quite like that. In fact, there's literature that shows, at least globally, that the land use doesn't really add much, and it's really just getting sort of the I mean it's this the carbon emission. There's lots of other drivers and forcings that matter before the land use matters on a global scale.
Because it's more of a regional impact.
Yes, that's exactly it. So.
That's it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And in fact, what I was finding more is that people would, kind of look at some sort of sensitivity experiment, like some of the ones I showed, and then compared a particular point or some regional rainfall data set or something and showed that there was a little bit of improvement. But once you expand out into a national sense or, of course, the global sense, it becomes less influential. So it's mostly the regional perspective that we're taking on this. That said, I don't think that that's not an important perspective,
Okay,
Yeah.
Is Ben here?
Ben is not here today.
Okay, because he did these dust polls.
Yeah, exactly.
So that would be good to show that there was this. He was able to capture something that by incorporating civics. And also, what have people done to simulate the bunny fence cloud cover?
The bunny, the bunny-proof fence event. So it's funny actually. So that's something that so if you want like specific ideas, that's like one on my list of 500. But I actually haven't seen simulations, and and in truth, I didn't actually look for simulations just yet. There was a rabbit-proof fence experiment, and by experiment, they were just looking at observations of rainfall and cloud cover and things like that from 2005 to 2007. In that particular region. But as for actually simulating those effects, how do we do it?
Okay, who else would be good to have this discussion? It'd be Ann and Andy about cloud formation. Because obviously running at 4 by 5 degrees is not sufficient for capturing what happens to recycling of clouds.
Yeah, they're also running Model 2, right? Which is not working.
Yeah. So it would be good to know. Do we? I mean, if it's a regional phenomenon, and crops are patches at a subgrid scale, so it'd be good to know how much that has to be accounted for to capture these regional effects.
Right.
I mean, so what would you? What way are you hoping to do this? You want to project future climate change with crop cover, or you want to take particular regions and see how they're going to be impacted by climate change?
Yeah, it's mostly. Go ahead.
Or there are particular phenomena we know now, and we want to simulate them and to explain that right now.
Yeah, so the rabbit-proof fence would be an example of a current and existing phenomenon, and that I think is interesting. My angle, and it's sort of a little bit in all of these things, right? So my angle is, we've noticed, so particularly the irrigation runs, we've done a study where we looked at sort of the intense irrigation in India and noticed some significant impacts to the monsoonal circulation. And I'd seen something similar before, and that was when I was actually doing some of my Pliocene runs, and those resulted in some pretty robust teleconnections, particularly in a warming over Alaska and a few other places that we were able to kind of track and understand. And so from that perspective, and of course that begs the question, right, at what scale do these land use changes have to be, or at what intensity does the management have to be? Irrigation itself seems to be one of those things, one component that has potential to be largely impactful. I suppose my question is, does that extend to other forms of management and to other cropping, and to sort of large scale, cropping patterns and sort of management techniques. So yeah, a little bit of everything that we can do. Yeah.
If I can, I mean, I think Nancy's idea of running, you know, the last 100 years or so and
Yeah.
seeing whether better crop functional types, better phenological development, better land use classifications, you know, which one of those things or combination of those things really do have tangible impacts and where would be definitely worth doing. And then the other thing, of course, is as we go towards the future, there are interactions. The same phenology may develop faster under warmer conditions or with CO2, and understanding whether those may be too subtle. Not necessarily that they're too subtle to make a difference, but for the climate models to really pick up on it, they may be too subtle. And then also, of course, the scenarios of land use change are. There could be a lot of difference in the climate projections depending on those, rather than just using the prescribed RCP 8.5.
Right, exactly. So from a future perspective, it's sort of investigating the sensitivity to these land use changes that I think becomes, at least as a start, becomes important.
And just to add to that, I mean, certainly looking at the extremes within a given grid cell, for example, maximum daily temperature and minimum daily temperature, that's probably where you might see more of an interesting story, rather than just say mean.
Yeah, and that's I mean in some of the when we look at sort of climate change on crop production, it's the Tmax and Tmin that become a bit more interesting to look at and a bit more impactful.
Right, and then the distinction then between the different crops, then you can really get into.
That's exactly right.
Well, what are the impacts of I mean, so the one way is the impacts of agriculture on climate, but you can then say, well, what are the impacts of the climate on agricultural production?
Right. Well,
explore those together, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's two sides, and so you know, I've been working with AgNet to kind of look at that side. There's this whole other part of the feedback that I think could be useful. And from that perspective, I think there's a lot of room for sort of looking at it and teasing it out. But that climate crop couples, again, I'm not suggesting we do it here, but it kind of gives you a little bit of looking at both sides of that interaction. And while you know the crop response might not be enough to impact, you know, sort of I mean, you're not sure if the climate model will actually see it on small enough scales, but if that impact, you know, if the yield is impacted quite a bit at all, it kind of just gives you both of them together in one, which I thought was just an interesting way to look at it.
And the overall trajectory, of course, of all these model development is to get higher resolution and more processes.
Right.
So starting this process, even if it's a generation or two away from having a big impact, might be worth doing it.
We're all looking at, you know, 1 degree by 1 degree.
Okay, so would you want to use a regional model rather than a global? Are you looking for something that would be the GCM, for which the GCM would be appropriate?
Probably more of and we can adjourn too if anyone needs to go.
Okay.
No, it's okay.
I gotta restart Skype.
Oh, sure, go for it. Yeah, and then we can keep talking. So if anyone wants to stay and talk to Nancy, then we can do that. If not, thank you very much.